The alarms did not wait for permission. They tore through the corridors of the assembly spire, red light bleeding across every wall, and I was already running before I understood why. My name, for the purposes of this record, is Edric Vale. I am an observer of the assembly, the ancient council that watches over 1,000 worlds and decides which of them are allowed to grow and which must be quietly folded into silence. I have held this position for longer than most species live. I thought I had seen every kind of emergency this council could produce. I was wrong. A junior archivist named Orlin met me at the chamber doors, his hands shaking so badly that the data slate he carried nearly slipped from his fingers. "Edric," he said, "the soul boundary has gone dark." I stopped walking. The soul boundary. The quarantine field. The wall we built around a single star system so long ago that most of the council members alive today had never questioned whether it was still necessary. It had simply always been there, the way a locked door is always there, until the day someone notices it has been standing open for longer than anyone can say. "Gone dark does not mean broken," I told him. "It means offline. Those are different words for different problems." "It is not offline," Orlin said. "It is gone. The field generators, the beacon relays, the entire structure. As if it was never built at all." I felt something cold settle behind my ribs, a feeling I had not experienced since the day, centuries ago, when I stood in this same chamber and watched the vote to seal that system pass by a wide and comfortable margin. "I need the full sensor logs," I said. He handed me the slate without another word. The chamber inside was already full. Consuls stood in tight clusters, arguing in low voices, their translators struggling to keep pace with the speed of their fear. Magistrate Orin, a stone-faced elder of the assembly who had chaired the original tribunal against humanity, stood at the center of it all, with her arms folded, staring at a floating display that showed the last confirmed reading from the SAL boundary. The number on that display had not changed in 6 hours. It read 0. "Edric," she said when she saw me, "you argued against the sentence. All those years ago. You said quarantine without contact was cruelty, dressed as mercy. Do you remember what you said would happen if we simply left them there and forgot them?" "I remember every word," I said. "Then tell the room," she said, "because I no longer trust my own memory of that day." I looked around at the frightened, angry faces of my colleagues, and I told them. "Humanity," I said, "was found guilty of nothing more than moving too quickly for our comfort. They built engines before they built patience. They argued among themselves in public, loudly, without shame, and our observers mistook that noise for danger. They had not attacked anyone. They had not broken a single treaty, because they had never been given the chance to sign one. Their crime, if you want to call it that, was simply being unpredictable to species who had grown addicted to predictability. So we voted to cut them off," Orin said quietly. "No warning, no explanation. One day their sky would simply stop answering, and we told ourselves that was kindness, because a clean silence was better than a war we assumed was coming." "I remember the vote," I said. "I remember standing exactly where I am standing now, telling this council that a species treated like a threat will eventually decide to become one, or it will find a way to answer the silence on its own terms. I was overruled. The field went up. Their transmissions blinked out of our instruments one by one, and everyone in this room went home satisfied that the problem had been solved. The problem, Orin said, has apparently been doing something for the past several decades that we did not think to check on. A new voice cut through the room, calm and clipped, belonging to a young tactical officer I did not recognize. She stood near the far wall with a set of readings that made even the loudest arguments stop. "There is more," she said. "Before the field went dark, we recorded a spike in gravitic output from deep inside the system. Not an explosion, not a weapon signature. It reads like construction, large scale, coordinated, sustained over years. Whatever built it did so slowly, deliberately, and quietly enough that our monitoring stations along the boundary never flagged it as a threat. How is that possible? Someone demanded. Those stations are automated. They would have reported any activity above baseline. Unless, the officer said, whoever was building did so specifically to stay below every threshold our instruments were designed to notice. They did not hide from us by accident. They studied our instruments first. The room went silent in a way that frightened me more than the alarms had. We sent a scout vessel to that boundary 8 months ago for a routine sweep, Oren said. The Vantage, standard crew, standard mission, nothing unusual. It has not reported in for 11 weeks. We assumed a communication fault. A relay failure, something ordinary. We assumed wrong, I said. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her face I had never seen there before. Not anger, not authority, fear, plain and unguarded. I want you on the next ship out, she said. You argued for mercy once. You understand what this species is capable of feeling, even if this council never bothered to understand what they are capable of doing. If there is a way to speak with whatever is on the other side of that silence, you are the only one in this chamber I trust to find it without getting us all killed in the attempt. I did not answer immediately. I was thinking of a data record I had reviewed a lifetime ago, buried in the tribunal archives, a single line from a human ambassador who had never been given the chance to speak before our verdict was passed. The line had stayed with me for centuries, the way certain warnings do, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment they finally become true. The line read, "You can silence a voice, but you cannot silence the will behind it. And one day, the silence itself will speak louder than we ever did." I closed my hand around the data slate. "I will go," I said. "Good," Oren answered, "because whatever is waiting behind that boundary has had decades to grow without anyone watching, and I have a very bad feeling that we are about to learn exactly what we built by trying so hard to make sure we never had to find out." The chamber emptied around me in a rush of orders and frightened voices, ships being reassigned, crews being briefed, messages sent to a dozen worlds warning them to reinforce their own quiet borders. I stayed behind for a moment, alone, looking at the last known image of the soul boundary before it went dark, a simple ring of pale light around a small yellow star. We built that wall to keep something contained, I thought. We never once considered that we might have simply given it time to grow into something the wall could no longer hold. Somewhere behind that vanished barrier, a species we had judged unworthy of even a warning had spent every one of those silent years building an answer of their own. I did not yet know what that answer would look like. I only knew, standing there in the empty chamber, with the alarms finally fading into a tense and watchful quiet, that we were no longer the ones asking the questions. We were about to become the ones being tested, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I had no idea whether the assembly would pass. The ship they gave me was called the Ashcombe, a lean assembly cruiser built for quiet observation rather than confrontation, and I stood on its bridge 3 days later, watching the stars stretch into unfamiliar lines as we crossed into territory no assembly vessel had entered without hesitation in generations. My crew was small by design. Oren wanted speed and discretion, not a show of force that might be read as an act of aggression by whatever waited on the other side. I had a pilot named Callum Ashworth, quiet and precise, the kind of person who spoke only when the silence had gone on a moment too long. Beside him sat a young systems analyst named Freya Lindquist, sharp-eyed and restless, the sort of mind that could not stand an unanswered question, and running quiet security beside me was a broad-shouldered veteran named Declan Foss, a man who had served on 3 border patrols and never once needed to fire a weapon, which in this line of work made him something of a legend. None of them had been alive when the sentence against humanity was passed. To them, Saul was a name in an old file, a footnote in a history lesson about a species that had simply stopped existing when the lights went out. I envied that ignorance a little. It must be easier to fly toward the unknown when you have no memory of the crime that created it. "We are approaching the last confirmed position of the vantage," Callum said, eyes fixed on the console. Still no signal. "Put it on the main display," I said. The image that resolved in front of us made Freya go very still. The vantage floated dead in space, its hull intact, no visible damage, no sign of an attack. Every light on its surface was dark. It looked less like a wreck, and more like something that had simply been switched off and left drifting, patient and untouched, the way a toy is set down by a child who has grown bored of it. "Life signs," I said. "None," Freya answered after a moment. "No power signature at all, not even residual heat bleed from the reactor core. Declan, that ship has been sitting dead for weeks, and something kept its hull from drifting off course. There is a stabilizing field around it. Faint, deliberate. Someone is holding it in place," Declan said. "Or something," I said. We brought the ashcombe alongside slowly, and I led a small team across in suits, built for the cold silence of open space. The interior of the Vantage was undisturbed. Chairs still pushed back from consoles as if the crew had simply stood up and walked away mid-conversation. No blood, no damage, no struggle of any kind. It was the absence of violence that unsettled me more than any wreckage could have. "Edric," Declan said from across the bridge, his voice tight, "you need to see this." He stood before the Vantage's main console, which had somehow been left running on a trickle of power despite every other system on the ship going dark. On the screen was a single message, written in careful, deliberate assembly script, as though whoever left it had taken the time to make certain we would understand every word. The message read, "Your crew is safe and has been returned to your border under escort. We did not wish to harm them, only to understand why you were watching us again after so long a silence. We hope this explanation reaches you before fear does. If you wish to speak with us honestly, continue forward. If you wish to test us the way you tested our patience once before, we would ask that you reconsider." Freya read it twice before she spoke. "They sent the crew back," she said. "They had every reason to keep them, to interrogate them, to use them as leverage against us, and instead, they just returned them and left a note. That is not the behavior of something afraid of us," Declan said quietly. "That is the behavior of something that no longer sees us as a threat worth taking seriously." I stood in front of that message for a long moment, feeling the same cold weight I had felt in the council chamber days before. It was not the tone of a captive pleading for mercy. It was the tone of an equal choosing patience, and choosing it deliberately, as though patience itself had become a kind of quiet power they no longer needed to prove to anyone. "We press on," I said. "Gently. No weapons drawn. I want every sensor sweep passive only. Whatever is out there has had years to prepare for a version of us that no longer exists, and I do not intend to confirm their worst assumptions before we have even spoken a single word to them." We returned to the ashcombe and continued deeper into the dead zone that used to be the Sol boundary, the ring of pale light long since gone, replaced now by nothing at all, no wall, no field, no warning marker of any kind. It was simply open space, as if the barrier had never existed, as if decades of assembly policy had been quietly erased by someone who found the whole idea faintly embarrassing. "I do not like this," Callum said as we crossed the threshold. "There is no field to breach. That means whoever took it down did not force their way out. They simply decided, at some point, that the wall no longer applied to them, and then it stopped applying. How do you dismantle a containment field from the inside without ever triggering a single alarm on our end?" Freya asked, half to herself. "That technology took our engineers a century to build. Taking it apart cleanly, without a single detectable disruption, that is not brute strength, that is precision, that is patience refined into a science. We flew in silence after that, the four of us watching the black expanse ahead with the particular kind of unease that comes from realizing you have walked confidently into a room you do not actually understand. It was Declan who broke the silence first. A few hours later, his voice low. "I keep thinking about the report you gave the council," he said, looking at me. "The line from that old ambassador, 'You cannot silence a voice, only its expression.' I used to think it was just something people say to make an old mistake sound more poetic than it was. I am starting to think it might have been a warning, plain and simple, and we just filed it away under old sentiment because it was easier than admitting we might have been wrong." "It was both," I said. "That is usually how warnings work. They sound like poetry, right up until the moment they become fact." Freya's console chimed softly, a new reading appearing on her screen, and her expression shifted from unease to something closer to disbelief. "Edric," she said, "I am picking up structures ahead, large ones, dozens of them, spread out along what used to be the outer edge of the Sol system, and they are not derelict. Power signatures are active, stable, and enormous." "Put them on screen," I said. The display resolved slowly, and none of us spoke for a long moment after it did. What we saw was not a ruin. It was not the quiet wreckage of a species that had spent decades starving behind a wall, the way every assembly report on isolated systems had always predicted they would. It was a skyline built among the stars, vast constructed rings, and long angular platforms catching the distant light of their own sun, arranged with a kind of confident order that suggested none of it had been built in a hurry. None of it had been built out of desperation. All of it had been built by people who had time, purpose, and no one left to answer to. "That cannot be humanity," Callum said quietly. "That is not possible in the time frame we sealed them in." Freya shook her head slowly, still watching the readings scroll past. "The architecture matches historical human design patterns, refined and scaled up dramatically, but the underlying logic is unmistakably theirs. This is not something they were given, Edric. This is something they built." I thought of the tribunal record again, the frightened, half-formed reports our observers had filed all those years ago, describing humanity as a species too impulsive to be trusted with the wider galaxy, too disorganized to ever pose a coordinated threat, too fractured by their own arguments to build anything that would last. I looked at the vast, quiet, gleaming structures ahead of us, standing patient and untouched in the dark, and understood with a sudden and total clarity that every single one of those old assumptions had been wrong. Declan leaned toward the viewport, watching the lights of that skyline drift closer. "Edric," he said quietly, "I do not think we are flying toward the ruins of a punished species anymore." "No," I agreed. "I think we are flying toward the doorstep of something we should have been asking permission to visit." And somewhere ahead of us, past that vast and silent construction, past the message left so carefully on a dead ship's console, I understood that whatever waited at the heart of the Sol system was no longer the frightened, contained thing our council had sentenced to silence. It had grown into something else entirely, something patient enough to wait us out, and confident enough not to hide what it had become. We slowed the Ashcombe to a crawl, and I gave the order to open every channel we had. If they were watching us approach, and I had no doubt they were, I intended for the first thing they heard from the assembly in decades to be a request, not a demand. I only hoped it would be enough to keep the four of us alive long enough to hear their answer. No response came to our open channels for almost an hour, and in that hour I learned exactly how loud silence can be when you know something intelligent is listening to it with you. Freya kept her eyes on the sensor readouts the entire time, watching the shapes of those distant structures grow larger and more defined. Callum's hands never left the controls, ready to change course at the first sign of hostility. Declan stood near the door to the bridge, quiet and watchful, the way soldiers stand when they have learned that the worst moments rarely announce themselves in advance. "Something just locked onto us," Callum said suddenly, his voice level but tight. "Not a weapon, a scanning field. It is reading the ship from bow to stern, every system, every compartment. Let it," I said. "We came here to be seen. There is no point pretending otherwise now." The scanning field passed over us twice, patient and thorough, and then without warning, our main display flickered and reformed on its own, taking on the shape of the assembly's own communication protocol, as if some outside hand had simply reached into our systems and rearranged them with a competence that made Freya swear under her breath. "They are inside our network," she said, "not damaging anything, just speaking our own language back to us, so we understand it clearly." A voice followed a moment later, calm and unhurried, carrying no accent I recognized from any human archive I had studied, as though whoever spoke had spent so long shaping their own way of speaking that the origin of it no longer mattered. "This is Sol Control," the voice said. "We see your vessel, and we recognize the markings of the Assembly Council. You are the first of your kind to approach this system since the day our sky went quiet. State your purpose, and understand that our patience, while considerable, has been earned through a great deal of hardship, and is not without its limits." I stepped forward before either of my crew could answer, my heart moving faster than I wanted anyone else to notice. "This is Edric Vale," I said, "an observer of the Assembly Council. I argued against the sentence passed on your people many years ago, and I have come now, without weapons drawn and without any intention of repeating that mistake, to understand what became of you and to ask, honestly, whether there is a way forward that does not require either of us to fear the other." A long pause followed, long enough that Declan's hand drifted quietly toward the console beside him, ready for whatever might come next. Then the voice returned, and something in its tone had shifted, not warmer exactly, but less guarded. "You may proceed toward the inner system," it said. "Slowly, and only along the corridor we will mark for you. Deviate from that path, and you will be redirected, gently if possible, forcefully if necessary. We have learned a great deal since your council decided we no longer deserved a warning. Edric Vale, and one of the things we learned is how to protect ourselves without needing to destroy anyone in the process." A narrow lane of soft blue light bloomed to life across our navigational display, winding between the vast structures ahead like a path drawn by a very careful and very deliberate hand. "Follow that exactly," I told Callum. He did, and none of us spoke, as the ashcomb drifted slowly along the marked corridor, passing beneath towering rings that hummed with quiet, contained power, past long platforms lined with what looked like solar collectors stretched taut across kilometers of open space, past shapes I did not have names for, because nothing in the Assembly's records had ever described a civilization building anything like them. "Freya," I said quietly, still recording all of this. "Every second," she answered, her voice hushed with something between fear and awe. "Edric, I do not think this was built by a species recovering from isolation. I think this was built by a species that used isolation as a kind of forge." Declan finally spoke, his eyes fixed on a cluster of smaller vessels moving in tight, coordinated patterns near one of the outer platforms, clearly some kind of active patrol. "They are not hiding their strength from us," he said. "They are letting us see exactly how capable they have become. That is either a very confident kind of honesty or a very deliberate kind of warning. Possibly both," I said, echoing my own earlier thought back at myself, and finding it far less comfortable the second time. The corridor of blue light led us deeper still, past what Freya identified as massive automated shipyards, their scale so far beyond anything the Assembly currently possessed that she stopped narrating her findings out loud entirely, simply staring at the readouts in a silence that told me more than words could have. Eventually, the path curved toward a single structure unlike any of the others, smaller, quieter, set apart from the vast industry surrounding it, glowing with a soft, steady light that felt almost deliberately calm against the enormous scale of everything around it. "That is where you are being directed," Sol Control said. "It is a place we built specifically for a day we were not certain would ever come. You may dock there. A single representative may disembark. We would ask that it be you, Edric Vale, since you are the name our own records associate with the one voice in your council that argued we deserved better than silence." "Your records," I repeated. "You kept records of our tribunal." "We kept records of everything," the voice answered. "That is, in part, why you are here now." I turned to my crew. "Stay with the ship," I said. "If anything happens to me, you return to the boundary immediately and you do not come back for me. That is an order, not a request." Declan did not look pleased, but he nodded. Freya looked as though she wanted to argue and thought better of it. Callum simply guided the Ashcombe into a gentle dock alongside the quiet structure, and I made my way alone through the airlock, my suit's small light the only illumination as the door ahead of me slid open on its own. Inside, the space was simple in a way I had not expected after everything we had passed to reach it. Soft light, clean lines, a single chamber built, I realized slowly, in a style that echoed old human architecture I had only ever seen in historical files, deliberately preserved rather than replaced by whatever advanced techniques they now clearly possessed. At the center of the room stood a tall, quiet console, and beside it, waiting calmly, was a figure that made me stop breathing for a moment. It was not human. It was a construct, sleek and articulated, built in a shape that suggested careful thought rather than imitation, and its presence carried an unmistakable weight of authority despite its silence. "I am not the one you came to speak with," it said, its voice gentle and measured, echoing the same calm tone Soul Control had used earlier. "I am simply here to answer for them, since they chose long ago not to greet visitors from the assembly in person, not out of fear, but out of a kind of pride I believe you will come to understand shortly." "Where are they?" I asked. "The people who built all of this." "They are not here," the construct answered. "They left this system many years ago, deliberately, quietly, and without any announcement to your council or any other. They did not leave out of desperation, and they did not leave out of anger, though I imagine both would have been reasonable responses to what was done to them. They left because they no longer needed to remain somewhere simply to prove they had survived it." I felt something tighten in my chest, a mixture of relief and a strange, unexpected grief. "They are alive," I said quietly, more to myself than to the construct. "Alive, and considerably more than that," it answered. "Would you like to understand how?" "Yes," I said. "I came a very long way to understand exactly that." The construct gestured toward the console, and the chamber's soft light dimmed slightly, giving way to a projection that bloomed slowly into the air between us, rows upon rows of recorded logs, images, voices, an archive built with obvious care, and, I understood almost immediately, built specifically for this exact moment, for whichever member of the assembly eventually found the courage to come looking. "Before we begin," the construct said, "I want you to understand something clearly, Edric Vale, because I suspect it will matter a great deal to whatever report you eventually deliver to your council. Everything you are about to see was left here on purpose, not as a trap, not as a threat, simply as a record, offered freely, to whoever finally cared enough to ask the question your council refused to ask before passing its sentence." "What question was that?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. The construct's voice softened further, carrying something that, had it belonged to a living creature, I would have called sorrow. "Why?" it said simply. "No one ever asked them why. Your council decided what they were, and then decided what to do about it, and at no point in that entire process did anyone think to ask them to explain themselves first. They built this archive because they wanted the answer to exist somewhere, even if no one ever came looking for it. And now, it seems, someone finally has." I stood in that quiet chamber, surrounded by a silent testimony no member of the assembly had ever bothered to request, and felt the full and uncomfortable weight of everything my council had failed to do settle over me at once. "Show me," I said. The construct inclined its head, and the projection expanded to fill the chamber entirely, and I understood, watching the first images resolve into focus, that I was no longer simply investigating a mystery. I was finally, after all these years, about to listen. The first voice belonged to a woman named Grace Sutton, and the recording was old enough that her image carried the soft static of early equipment. Equipment built, the construct told me, within the first year after the sky went silent. Her voice was steady, though her eyes carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent every waking hour since the silence began trying to solve a problem no one had prepared her for. "If anyone ever finds this," Grace Sutton said, "I want you to know we did not panic. We wanted to." Every instrument on Earth went quiet at the same moment. Every satellite link beyond our own orbit simply stopped answering, and for the first several days we assumed it was some kind of technical failure, something we could repair if we simply worked hard enough at it. It took us almost 2 weeks to accept that nothing on our end was broken. The silence was not a malfunction. It was a decision, made by someone, somewhere, about us, without a single word of explanation. The recording shifted, and a new voice took over. A man named Nathan Cole, an engineer, whose calm, methodical tone carried none of Grace Sutton's exhaustion, only a quiet determination that felt, even across all this time, remarkably steady. "We do not know who did this or why," Nathan Cole said, "but we do know one thing for certain. Whoever built the barrier around us wanted us to stay small, stay frightened, and eventually stop trying. We have decided, as a species, that we are not going to give them that satisfaction. If they intend to leave us here in silence, then we intend to spend that silence becoming something they never expected to find on the other side of it." The construct paused the recording briefly, its measured voice filling the quiet chamber. "That decision," it said, "became the foundation of everything that followed. They did not spend those years grieving what they had lost. They spent them building, methodically, deliberately, generation after generation, refining every field of knowledge they had access to, because it was the only direction left open to them." The projection continued, and I watched years compress into moments. A young woman named Lucy Bennett, standing before a room of engineers, describing early attempts to map the exact frequency and structure of the barrier that had sealed them inside their own system. A careful, patient effort that took, according to the timestamp scrolling past, almost 11 years before they understood the field well enough to even begin considering how it might eventually be taken apart. A man named Oliver Hart appeared next, older, his voice carrying the particular calm of someone who had spent a lifetime solving problems most people would have considered impossible. "We are not trying to break this wall down," Oliver Hart said, addressing an audience I could not see. "Breaking it would tell whoever built it that we are exactly the kind of desperate, reckless species they assumed us to be. We are going to understand it so completely that one day we simply walk through it, calmly, on our own terms, and by the time anyone notices, there will be nothing left to stop." The construct's voice returned, quieter now. "It took them just under 60 years, it said. 60 years of research conducted entirely in isolation, without a single outside voice to guide them, without any confirmation that their efforts would ever succeed, and without any certainty that anyone beyond their own sky even remembered they existed. They did not know, during any of that time, whether your council was watching, waiting, or had simply forgotten them entirely. They chose to prepare regardless." The projection shifted again, and I saw a woman named Charlotte Pierce standing before what looked like the very field generators Freya had described days earlier, her expression calm in a way that suggested this moment had been imagined and rehearsed for longer than I could easily comprehend. "Today," Charlotte Pierce said, "we take the first structure apart, not with force, not with anger, with understanding. Because understanding was always going to be the only tool sharp enough to cut through what was done to us." The recording that followed showed no explosion, no dramatic confrontation, simply a slow, careful, almost surgical process, engineers working in patient coordination across months, each piece of the vast containment field studied, isolated, and quietly disassembled, exactly as Freya had guessed, exactly as Declan had feared, a lock picked calmly by people who had never once stopped believing they would eventually find the key. A final voice closed the recording, belonging to a man named Daniel Marsh, older still, his tone carrying none of the anger I might have expected after everything I had just witnessed, only a steady, thoughtful calm. "We thought about announcing ourselves once the barrier was gone," Daniel Marsh said. "We thought about sending a message to whoever built it, demanding an explanation, demanding an apology, demanding to be seen. In the end, we decided against it. We did not need their permission to leave the first time, and we were not going to ask for it the second time either. We packed what mattered, and we went, quietly, in every direction at once, and we left this record behind only because we believed, someday, someone honest enough to come looking would deserve the chance to understand why." The construct let the projection fade slowly, the chamber returning to its soft, quiet light. "They did not seek revenge," it said. "They did not return to punish the council that sentenced them. They simply outgrew the need for your judgment entirely, and in doing so, they left behind the one lesson your council never expected to receive from the very species it once tried to silence." "What lesson is that?" I asked quietly, though I already felt the shape of the answer forming. "That silence, offered without mercy, does not end a story," the construct said. "It only decides who gets to write the next part of it alone." I stood there for a long moment, surrounded by the quiet weight of everything I had just seen, thinking of Oren's frightened voice back in the council chamber, thinking of the tribunal record I had carried with me for centuries, thinking of the simple, unbearable truth that we had judged an entire species based on nothing more than our own discomfort, and had never once considered what that species might become once given nothing left to lose. "There is one more thing," the construct said, its tone shifting slightly, carrying something I could not quite place. "Before you return to your council, I believe you should know where they went, and what they have been doing since." I looked up at it, my heart suddenly loud in my own ears. "Show me," I said again, though this time the words came out far quieter than before. The construct inclined its head, and a new image began to resolve in the projection, one that made the calm I had carried through this entire chamber, finally, completely, disappear. The image that resolved before me was not a single scene, but a slow, sweeping map, the kind of star chart the assembly used in its own war rooms, except this one was marked with symbols I recognized instantly, small pale markers scattered across dozens of systems far beyond the old Sol boundary, each one glowing with the quiet, steady light of an active, functioning settlement. "They did not simply leave," I said slowly. "They spread out." "They spread out carefully," the construct answered, and quietly, and without announcing themselves to a single one of the species whose territory they passed near. They wanted room to grow without inviting the same fear that led to their imprisonment in the first place. Every settlement you see marked here was built with the same patience that dismantled the barrier around Sol, slowly, deliberately, without asking permission, because they had already learned what happens when they wait for it. I studied the map more closely, and something cold moved through me as I began to recognize a pattern in the placement of those markers, a pattern that had nothing to do with simple expansion and everything to do with something far more deliberate. "These positions," I said quietly. "Some of these are near other quarantined systems, old assembly containment zones, places we sealed off, the same way we sealed off Sol." The construct did not answer immediately, and its silence told me more than words could have. "They have been listening at the edges of those barriers," it finally said. "Not to interfere, not to break them open on anyone else's behalf, simply to listen, the way no one ever listened to them, so that if any of those species ever found their own way through, there would be someone nearby who understood exactly what that first, frightened moment of freedom would feel like." I thought of Oren's face back in the council chamber, of the dozens of other quiet, comfortable quarantines the assembly maintained across 100 systems, each one built on the same quiet confidence that had once sealed Saul away without a single word of warning, each one assumed, without evidence, to be safely, permanently contained. "How many of those barriers still stand?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "That," the construct said, "is a question I believe your council will need to answer for itself, and soon, because I do not think every one of them is as stable as your instruments currently report." I left that quiet chamber some time later, my mind heavy with everything I had seen, and returned to the ashcombe where Callum, Freya, and Declan waited in a silence that told me they had already guessed, from my expression alone, that whatever I had learned had changed something fundamental in the shape of the mission we had been sent to complete. "We are not flying home with a mystery solved," I told them. "We are flying home with a warning, and I am not certain the council is going to want to hear it." The return journey felt longer than the one that brought us here, though the distance was identical, and I spent most of it composing, then discarding, then composing again, the words I would need to explain what waited for the assembly beyond that vanished boundary. When we finally reached the council chamber, Orin was waiting exactly where I had left her, though the frightened uncertainty I remembered from before had hardened into something more controlled, more careful, the posture of someone bracing for news she already suspected would be difficult. "Tell me everything," she said simply. I did. I told her of the Vantage, returned untouched and unharmed. I told her of the skyline built among the stars, the shipyards Freya could not finish describing, the calm and unhurried voice of Sol Control guiding us along a corridor they had chosen to let us see, rather than one we had forced our way into. I told her of Grace Sutton and Nathan Cole and Lucy Bennett and Oliver Hart and Charlotte Pierce and Daniel Marsh, of 60 years spent understanding a wall instead of breaking it, of a departure carried out with no farewell and no request for forgiveness, because neither had ever been offered to them in the first place. And finally, I told her of the map, of the quiet markers scattered near the edges of other old containment zones, of a species patient enough to wait outside someone else's prison, simply so they would not be alone the moment they finally walked free. The chamber, which had been loud with fear the day I left, was almost unbearably silent by the time I finished. It was Magistrate Orin who spoke first, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "We did not create an enemy," she said slowly. "We created a lesson, and now it is standing at the edge of every wall we have ever built, waiting to see whether we finally learn it on our own, or whether we make them teach it to us the same way we once taught it to them." "I do not believe they intend harm," I said. "Everything I witnessed suggested restraint, patience, a species that chose to grow rather than retaliate. But I also do not believe they intend to ask our permission for anything, ever again, and I think this council needs to accept that fact before we make another decision that assumes otherwise." A young consul near the back of the chamber, one of the newer members who had not yet learned to disguise fear as diplomacy, spoke up hesitantly. "What do we do?" he asked. "Do we send envoys? Do we reinforce the other containment zones? Do we simply wait and hope they never decide we deserve the same silence we once gave them?" Orin did not answer him directly. Instead, she turned to me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, both of us thinking, I suspected, of the very same line, the one buried for centuries in the tribunal archive, the one I had quoted back to this chamber only weeks before. "You cannot silence a voice, only its expression," she said finally, quietly, almost to herself, "and one day the silence itself will speak louder than we ever did." "That day has come," I said. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had known her, Magistrate Orin looked less like the head of a confident, ancient council, and more like someone standing at the very beginning of a story she no longer had the power to write alone. "I do not know, even now, what the Assembly will decide to do with everything I brought back from that quiet chamber beyond the old soul boundary. I do not know whether we will reach out with honesty this time, or whether old fear will win out over hard lessons the way it so often has before. What I do know is this. Somewhere out among the dark between the stars, a species we once judged unworthy of even a simple warning is still moving, still building, still watching quietly at the edges of every silence we have ever imposed on anyone else. They are not waiting for our forgiveness. They are not waiting for our permission. They are simply waiting, patient and unhurried, to see whether the rest of us finally learn, before it is too late, the one lesson they were never given the chance to teach us the gentle way. 3 nights after my report to the council, alone in my quarters, my personal console chimed softly with an incoming transmission carrying no origin marker the assembly's systems could identify. I opened it slowly, half expecting static, half expecting nothing at all. Instead, a single line of text appeared, calm and unhurried, written in careful, deliberate assembly script, the same steady hand that had left a message on a dead ship's console weeks before. "Thank you for finally asking why, Edric Vale," it read. "We have been waiting a very long time for someone to well." I sat in the quiet of my own quarters for a long while after that, staring at those simple words, understanding at last that the silence humanity had once been sentenced to was never truly gone. It had simply been listening this entire time, patient and unafraid, for the exact moment someone finally cared enough to break it honestly, and somewhere out among the stars, I suspected, it was still listening now.